all the things that these liberals claim to be in favour of, the Iranian regime is against. Yet the people who seem to hate Israel so much, they're prepared to swallow all of that.
The grooming gangs are pretty certain will go down as the greatest betrayal the Labour Party ever inflicted. Yeah. The supposed party of social justice would happily throw the most vulnerable people in society under the bus if it meant polishing the reputation of multiculturalism.
But up until 2 minutes ago, we're going to write all of this off as a right-wing panic.
This is the best thing to happen to Kneecap, isn't it? They'd never get publicity like this otherwise.
It's allowed them to pose as they've wanted to pose throughout their short career as sort of radicals. Why give in and indulge them?
Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. Thrilled to be joined, as ever, by Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello, Fraser.
And returning guest, Spike columnist, Joanna Williams. Welcome.
Hello.
Thanks for coming, Joanna. We've got loads to talk about today. We'll be discussing the Iran-Israel conflict, the explosive new report on grooming gangs, and the trial of Ncap. So, Tom, there's been about a week of exchanging fire between Israel and Iran. This time last week, or Friday morning, we awoke to the news that essentially huge swathes of Iran's top military brass have been taken out. Many of their nuclear facilities have been taken out by this quite audacious strike by the Israelis. Do you want to just take us back to there, and then we can go from there?
No, absolutely. It began almost a week ago now with that incredible, audacious, as you say, strike on primarily Iranian nuclear facilities, a lot of the IRGC, top brass, nuclear scientists, and so on. I think really demonstrating just how far Israel had penetrated into the upper echelons of the Iranian regime there, launching drones from within Iranian territory itself and executing what I think was, as you said, a very sort of surgical attack on the regime that had been menacing them for so long, but also most crucially had been revealed to be enriching uranium up to the 60% level, which is within kind of striking distance of what you'd need to load onto a nuclear weapon. Obviously, since then, there's been exchange of fire day by day. You've had Israel continue to degrade the kind of ballistic missile capacity as well as the nuclear facilities, as well as continuing to effectively kind of assassinate from the air various Iranian figures. Iran's aim in the other direction, a little more sloppy, shall we say, today. On the day that we were recording, a hospital in southern Israel was hit. There's also been apartment blocks which have been torn apart by Iranian fire. And of course, now we're getting to the point where, and our viewers and listeners might well know much more than us by the time this actually comes out, given how fast things are moving, about what happens next, particularly in relation to the US. It's become pretty clear that whilst Israel has been very effective in degrading some of their nuclear facilities, particularly in the Natanz site, that the Fordo one, the one that's kind of buried in this mountainous terrain, would require American bunker busting munitions and most likely American planes as well in order to get through. And Donald Trump has essentially been trying to signal that he's very strongly thinking about it, I suppose. There's a big debate going on about whether or not this is a bluff, a kind of madman tactic to try and bring the mullahs around the negotiating table, as seemed to be Trump's intention going into all of this, or whether or not he's actually boiling to do it. So it's a tremendous moment of peril for the people of Israel, the people of Iran suffering under that horrendous regime there in Tehran, as well as the region and the world. But I'm sure I'm not the only one of us who's been struck by the very kind of strange way in which this war is being described, as if it was entirely unprovoked on the Israeli side, despite all of the ways in which Iran has been menacing Israel, both directly and indirectly over recent years, but also many decades. And also this kind of, this desire to really mangle it into the kind of Iraq War 2.0 sort of framing. So both of which I think really don't do justice to what's happening now and also what has happened in the recent past and why those interventions were so disastrous. So yeah, but a real moment in which the world turns, as it were, but it does feel like our commentariat and our politicians are incapable of seeing this in a particularly clear-eyed fashion.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And I think the point where that came home to me most strikingly was this morning with news about the bombing of the hospital in Israel. When you think that there's been hospitals that have been bombed when the Israelis tried to go after Hamas, who we know have been hiding in tunnels and hospitals in Gaza, the sheer weight of condemnation of Israeli forces for going anywhere near a hospital whatsoever. And yet when Iran bombs a hospital in Israel, it's almost as if it just warrants a shrug of the shoulders, not just from the media in the West, but from all those anti-war activists as well. And it kind of really makes absolutely clear the hollowness of their claims to be just in favour of peace or just anti-war. Clearly, they've picked a side in this fight.
Yeah, and certainly at the time that we're speaking, the strikes, as you said, Tom, they've been surgical. They've been very clearly targeted on specific military targets, whether that's military top brass nuclear scientists or military bases. And yet, nevertheless, the narrative is that Israel is simply being bloodthirsty, wants to maim and kill as many civilians as possible. I mean, what do you make of that, Joe? I mean, clearly this has no basis in fact.
Yeah, no, it really, really doesn't. I mean, it seems to me that it's really a continuation of the way in which Israel has been spoken about since October the 7th, when at that point, really, it seems to me Israel should have been the victim. It was Israel that was attacked. It's Israel that has come under attack really throughout by Iranian-funded terrorist groups of one form or another. And it seems to me that Iran has really been behind a lot of what's been going on in that area and is a real threat to Israel. Yet Israel is never allowed to be the victim in any of this. Israel is never allowed to be the innocent party or the attacked party. We've always got to find what Israel has done wrong and find reasons to blame Israel. Even when they're under attack, we have to blame Israel for somehow being the aggressor in this situation. They're never allowed to even defend themselves.
Yeah, and every defensive move is seen as fundamentally aggressive. Tom?
No, absolutely. I mean, we've seen the continuation of that narrative, which is when someone attacks Israel viciously, either directly or in Iran's case through its proxies, whether that's in Gaza or in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen. And yet when Israel responds, it's a war crime, it's unprovoked, it's bloodthirsty, as you say. It seems to me that Israel is expected to put up with things that no other nation on earth would be expected to put up with. If there was a country not too far away from us which was committed to our destruction, which was constantly saber-rattling in that direction, which had funded barbaric armies who made incursions into our territory, murdered and raped our people and kidnapped several hundred of them, whilst was building up to making a nuclear weapon, or at least having the technology to allow them to make a nuclear weapon should they so choose. The idea that it would be completely mad, bad, imperialistic somehow to respond to that clear and present threat, it's absurd when you put it on any other country. But obviously this is the lens in which Israel is viewed, and also I think the lens through which people who claim to be anti-war but are really just have become kind of both anti-Israel and kind of anti-Western, like anything which is seen as striking a blow against American imperial hegemony and Israel kind of presented as America's sort of outpost in the Middle East and their very reductive narrative. It's kind of all to the good, or at least they know which side they're on, which makes absolutely no sense given the quite clear imperial designs of Iran over large parts of the Middle East in recent years, the way in which it's moved into the vacuum in Iraq, the way in which it has funded these proxies for a very long time. It's fascinating to still see, figures like Jeremy Corbyn popping up and, making excuses or warping what is going on there. And the added irony being that, this is a man who always campaigning against nuclear disarmament, let alone anything else. So it just shows that this is the warped way in which they talk about these issues. And it's not to say that there aren't, huge threats and perils, potentially in play here, particularly around the question of American or Western involvement. I don't want to see Western forces getting into direct conflict with Iran. It's certainly the case that that's something which is deeply controversial within Trump's America, as well as the rest of the world. At the same time, people are using that as a way to present what Israel itself is currently doing as somehow illegitimate and imperialistic when it's responding to direct conflict and threat and saber-rattling, which has been going on for some time. So I think it's a combination of that ideological kind of anti-Western mindset which is set in amongst certain sections, certainly of the progressive left, but also generally a desire to project onto every conflict our own kind of experiences with disastrous Western adventurous interventionism, when this is not, certainly at this point in time, what we're looking at here.
This episode of the Spike podcast is sponsored by Shopify. Now, running a small business can be a really tough gig. Here at Spiked, we're a tiny team with a very big to-do list, so we know exactly what it's like. Anything that can ease that administrative burden, let us focus on our real work, is worth its weight in gold. Luckily, for millions of businesses around the world, there is a way to make everything so much simpler, and that thing is called Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of growing businesses around the world, including household names like Mattel and Gymshark. One of the reasons it's so popular for small businesses in particular is because it makes getting started so easy. For instance, it's got an inbuilt design studio with hundreds of ready-to-use templates for websites. Shopify also has a bunch of AI tools which can help you with your descriptions, headlines, and just about everything your online shopfront needs. Also, you're never alone with Shopify. It comes with world-class expertise, everything from managing your inventory to international shipping and returns. And Shopify's email and social media campaigns will make you feel like you've got an entire marketing team behind you. You can be sure your brand will be wherever potential customers are, wherever they're strolling or scrolling. Put simply, if you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. So, turn your big business idea into with Shopify on your side. Sign up now for your £1 per month trial period and start selling today at shopify.co.uk/spiked. Go to shopify.co.uk/spiked. That's shopify.co.uk/spiked. And Joe, I mean, we've not just seen condemnations of Israel, which are half the course, probably not even worth the remarking on anymore, but people actually waving the Iranian flag in London, in Glasgow, in the Western world. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, I think it's quite astonishing, and I can only hope that these people are so ignorant that they don't really know what it is they're celebrating. Because if they did, if they look at the oppression of women, as Ashma Amini as the most famous example, woman who showed hair from her hijab and was arrested and then died in police custody, and far from the only woman. I mean, this is one of the most oppressive regimes in the whole world, brutally murdering its own citizens, women for showing their hair, anybody who seems to protest. I mean, men who've been executed for joining women in protesting against the regime. All the things that these liberals, anti-war protesters, claim to be in favour of, the Iranian regime is against. You know, it's the most misogynistic, homophobic, backward regime you can imagine. And yet the people who seem to hate Israel so much, they're prepared to swallow all of that and take to the streets with Iranian flags. I just think it's morally degraded. It's completely disgusting. And you just can't imagine what people in Iran who've been fighting against the regime themselves must think when they turn on the television and see Western idiots taking to the streets, waving the flag of the regime that they hate so much themselves.
It's notable how many Iranians living in the UK are protesting against Iran right now, whereas the sort of kafir set are protesting in favour of that regime.
I mean, you almost feel like it's too obvious just to point this out, but it is. If you look at what the supposed progressive anti-imperialist left are about, and if you look at what their supposed principles are, then surely they should be raging against Iran rather than protesting in its favour. These are people who see racism and misogyny and all kinds of isms absolutely everywhere, and yet turn a blind eye to a regime that's beating up women in the street for having their hair out. There's also the kind of supposed kind of anti-imperial posture, which again, through this kind of too campist kind of ideology that they have, leads them to, at the very least, make excuses for the Iranian Republic, if not absolutely support it in many instances. It makes absolutely no sense when you're talking about a power which has, extended its reach into so many places around the Middle East. You've got Hezbollah squatting over the people of Lebanon for a very long time. You've got the way in which they've really taken advantage of the collapse of Iraq post the intervention there. Makes absolutely no sense. And you do just come back to this. This is clearly about something else. How could you possibly ally with this? And it's not. It's also quite clear that there is a slippage just between saying, we're worried about another regime change, we're worried about the West getting involved, entirely legitimate, but that's not what form this protest takes. It's often actually flying the flag. It's Jeremy Corbyn, I think back in 2013, addressed a meeting of people that was celebrating the Iranian Revolution itself. You think that is surely a step that one doesn't want to take if you're just trying to take some sort of principled stance against Western intervention or imperialism. So this is another example, many of which we've seen over recent years, of just a real kind of moral sickness amongst these people that they can't seem to recognise, even when it's as blatant as making excuses for one of the most brutal and bigoted regimes on the planet.
This episode is also sponsored by AG1. Now, I'd never change what I do or where I live. Journalism is my life and London is my home. But I'd be lying to you if I told that I've got a lot of free time on my hands. It's a real struggle to squeeze in the gym or to spend any more time than necessary watching what I eat. Needless to say, this wasn't so great for my health. But then finding AG1 changed all of this. AG1 is a comprehensive and convenient blend of over 70 high-quality ingredients. It's become my essential morning ritual. Since I first discovered it, I never go anywhere without AG1. The biggest difference it's made is to my immune system. For years, it felt like I was living with a permanent cold. But thanks to the vitamin C and zinc in AG1, I seem to weather the seasons like an ox. Even the London Underground during flu season is no match for AG1. Then there's my overall energy levels. AG1 is packed to the brim with minerals like copper, chromium and phosphorus. It puts a spring in your step and even helps unlock energy from your food. I'm far less dependent on caffeine than I used to be, but I'm just generally in a much better headspace. Now, I probably would have given up on AG1 by now if it wasn't so damn simple to take. I mix 1 scoop in a glass of water before breakfast every morning. That's it, and it's changed my life. AG1 is nutrition made easy, backed by proper experts. If you want to support your health 7 mornings a week, start with AG1. Subscribe now and get a free bottle of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription. To take advantage of this brilliant offer, just go to drinkag1.com/spiked. Go on, your best self is just a few clicks away. That's drinkag1.com/spiked. So, Keir Starmer has U-turned and will call a national inquiry into grooming gangs. The thing that forced his hand was the publication or the arrival of Louise Casey's audit into these crimes.
Rotherham, there was deliberate covering up, yes. I was going through a child's file and I realised somebody Tipp-Axed out the word Pakistani.
Now, the audit seems to have confirmed many things that we already knew. There's a disproportionate number of Pakistani men involved in these crimes, that actually the data collection is very poor, but where there is data, that's what it shows. It seems to have almost forced a lot of people, not just Keir Starmer, but many people among the Liberal establishment have had to say, I was always in favour of an inquiry. I've always cared about this issue. Let's start speaking openly and honestly. What have you made of first of all, the report and the reaction?
Well, I think the key word in words in what you were just saying there, Fraser, is what we already knew.
Yeah.
And that's what's just struck me listening to the news every day this week since this report came out, that there's nothing really new here. Anybody who's had an open mind on this issue for 20 years now, I mean, let's be honest, 2 decades, this has been in and around the news with various cases coming to court, pictures in newspapers of groups of men who've been arrested and imprisoned, details of the crimes that they've committed, and there've been various other local authority reports. This we have all known about this for years, and yet it's not just Keir Starmer who's suddenly miraculously, as if he's just heard about this for the very first time following Casey's review, but it's whole swathes of the media, of the commentariat as well, who, up until 2 minutes ago, we're going to write all of this off as a right-wing panic, as, jumping on a right-wing bandwagon, even to raise this issue.
Calling for inquiries because they want to jump on a bandwagon of the far right, then that affects politics. And
it's now, okay, so this report's been published, a very good report, has some really shocking things in it. Like there's one section where it talks about a denial, pages and pages on the denial that's gone on. And it's now like, oh, okay, suddenly we can admit that this is what's been going on. And not only that, we have to kind of backtrack and pretend that this was what we thought all along.
Yeah.
And I think it's incredibly deceitful. I mean, it's not just deceitful to the British public and a problem for democracy, but it's incredibly deceitful to the victims to say, well, we weren't going to take you seriously when it was just you who were coming forward saying this. We have to wait until we've had somebody from the House of Lords, come down and produce this official document. And it's only now that we're going to start taking this seriously. At least, Starmer could be honest and say, well, I did doubt this, or I wasn't prepared to go there. I wasn't going to stir up that hornet's nest. I wasn't going to potentially unpick the cult of multiculturalism that we've been building in this country for decades. I wasn't prepared to do that. But okay, now I've changed my mind and I am. Instead, you get this kind of denial even of the previous denialism, and it just sends your head spinning.
And there were so many sort of bogus arguments, when the sort of demands for an inquiry were being made. Partly one that was debunked pretty thoroughly in this report. There was this Home Office report in 2020 that said that, well, we don't have any data to confirm the ethnicity of the perpetrators, but we're pretty sure they're mostly white. There was that, which the KC audit quite rightly says this is based on no evidence whatsoever, not on any research that can be backed up. There's also this line trotted out that we'd already had an inquiry, which was also nonsense because the child abuse inquiry, as sprawling as it was, didn't really cover the grooming gangs issue in any detail. But that line was trotted out. That denialism, that instinct to brush this under the carpet, it's just been a continuous feature of this.
Oh, no, absolutely. And even now, there's an attempt to do that. I think the way in which you've had politicians as well as the sort of liberal left media respond is to kind of skate over the question of ethnicity, the question of cover-up and so on, and then just go straight to, but she says we shouldn't politicise it.
Yeah.
Dame Casey says that we shouldn't politicise it, therefore those terrible Tories should stop making such a song and dance about it. Where were they for 14 years, etc., etc. It's not to say that the Tories don't have some questions to answer, given the fact that they're now somewhat ridiculously trying to take credit for an inquiry that they didn't even try, let alone fail to hold over the course of the time they were in power. That being said, that seems to be a deflection, first of all, from the extent to which, as we've already been talking about, this audit, although it probably didn't need to happen, it's useful that it has happened, has ripped to shreds the denialism of everyone in this, the way in which there was this attempt to suggest that there's clearly no disproportion or there's no questions to be answered there. I mean, as you were saying, Fraser, there's still a huge difficulty in trying to paint some kind of national picture because there's I think it's 2/3 of actual police authorities just don't even record ethnicity data. But where there is that data, places like Greater Manchester, disproportion where child sexual exploitation is concerned is pretty clear. So according to their numbers, it was something like 50% of the perpetrators were from some sort of Asian background. It's believed to be predominantly Pakistani, whereas in Greater Manchester, they account for about 20% of the population. This is clear. This is stark. It's so obvious that that Home Office report from 2020 and the way in that was used to supposedly end the argument, that all of that was just nonsense. And so what people have had to do is just kind of try and change the subject.
Yeah.
Which I think is deeply unpleasant, not least because it wasn't that long ago that people were just flatly calling all of this a sort of racist conspiracy theory. I think the other reason the deflection is sort of shameless is because it does seem like the focus has become oddly on the Tories, when obviously this raises very direct questions about Labour. The towns in which this took place are Labour areas, Labour-run councils. Labour MPs started to change a bit in recent years because of how politics has mixed up a little bit, but nevertheless, these are places in which representatives of that party were clearly part of either turning a blind eye, refusing to acknowledge the evidence of their own eyes, or actively covering things up. And that's something which it becomes therefore particularly unpleasant to try and deflect onto the people who have actually been raising this issue for some time, rather than talk about the Labour Party and how their fingerprints are all over this. And I do think in a kind of crowded field, within time, particularly if this inquiry is worth its salt and actually really digs into those questions about what happened locally, who was involved and what have you, the grooming gangs, I'm pretty certain, will go down as like the greatest betrayal the Labour Party ever inflicted on their supposed heartlands, on working class, and in the case of the victims, very poor and vulnerable girls. The supposed party of social justice would happily throw the most vulnerable people in society under the bus if it meant polishing the reputation of multiculturalism, which they've picked every single time. So we can only hope that that's what will out, rather than all this nonsense kind of partisan bickering that's kicked off.
It is worth stressing that, the people in Labour who did raise this were also sidelined. Anne Cryer, MP for Keighley, was one of the first to raise this, was told in no uncertain terms that you'll be considered a racist.
Can you imagine what it felt like to have only parts of, not all of, but parts of the Muslim, the Pakistani community in Keighley saying that I was a racist because I was raising these very difficult issues? I'm not kidding you, it was very, very difficult.
Sarah Champion was sacked from Jeremy Corbyn's front bench for writing about this in the Sun newspaper. So even when good people have tried to make their voices heard, they've been come down on like a ton of bricks by the Labour machine.
No, absolutely. But just to reinforce the point Tom was making there about the continual denial, attempts at denial and obfuscation over this. I mean, the use of the word Asian men that we're seeing in all the press coverage is itself very, very slippery because, these are not Chinese or Malaysian men. This is a very specific section of the Pakistani community. It's not even all Pakistani heritage men. It is one particular section of the Pakistani community. And it's places like Bradford, that have got a very, very high proportion of Pakistani heritage men who, and Bradford Council has refused point blank to hold an inquiry. And it is literally just in the past, I think, 24 hours that they've backtracked on that and agreed to hold an inquiry at long last. But I mean, the scale of abuse that could have taken place in Bradford, that's estimated to have taken place, again, extending over decades, it's just mind-boggling. And yet the refusal to even countenance this until 24 hours ago, I think at the moment we've got this kind of political blame game between Labour and the Tory party. But I really hope that when this proper inquiry gets underway, that there needs to be a whole layer of kind of police officers, social workers, teachers, people who were involved at a professional level who were dealing with these girls, presumably the people who were running the children's homes. It's not good enough just to say, oh, well, this was what they wanted to do. They wanted to get out or they absconded. Actually, if you're an adult and you're in charge of a children's home, you lock the door. If you think that there's a car outside with people who are potentially going to rape the girls inside your children's home, you lock the door and you say, no, you are not going out. And it just seems there's a real problem with adult authority in these areas. And yes, there's clearly political problems, but there's a whole layer of professionals who should have been responsible for these girls, who should have been working and protecting these girls, who utterly failed. And we all know why they failed, because they weren't prepared to they were more concerned about appearing to be racist than they were about protecting these vulnerable girls.
And there are so many other parallels in public life with that problem. I mean, when it comes to racism, of course, we had the Manchester Arena bombing where one of the security people didn't want, or someone working at the venue didn't want to intervene because he thought he would appear racist. I mean, how did the Tavistock scandal go on for so long? Because people were terrified of appearing transphobic. So time and again, you see political correctness allowing these absolutely grotesque things to happen in the name of making people appear good.
And this, again, is something that we've known for a very long time. We report after report, the Telford report, the Rotherham report, the report in Oxfordshire, which came out many years ago. The picture is always the same, which is that police and local authorities held back from investigating this because they were worried about what it might do to race relations. I believe in the Telford report, although I might be mistaken, there was an explicit quote about they were worried a race riot might kick off, a real kind of low view of the white working class, but also the British Pakistani communities, if they wouldn't want to be involved in rooting out, child rapists in their own midst, because that might upset them culturally, is and its own kind of prejudice at play there as well. But you do have to wonder, what has happened to a society, to a state, to people who are charged with keeping law and order, with protecting the most vulnerable people in society and so on, where they're actually more afraid of being called names and of protecting children from serial abuse and exploitation. That's something which is, obviously we understand the trends that have gotten to this point, but that profound moral cowardice is something that people really have to be held for account to. We might understand how we got here, but it certainly doesn't excuse it in any way, which is why you hope that whether it's in the form of the inquiry or further investigations to come, that accountability properly happens. You don't have this fobbing off, which we've seen with some of the previous more localised reviews, which is this was a systemic problem and therefore we will do better next time. That's clearly not going to be good enough anymore.
I mean, it's a very minor point in comparison with the abuse of the girls, which is obviously the main thing here. But I do think there's that politically, we're seeing this kind of trend of people kind of denying what everybody in the public knows about and has known about for years. And then something happens and immediately they turn around and pretend that they've known about this all along. I mean, it just seems a kind of bizarre thing to say, perhaps, but some interesting parallels with the situation in America. With Biden, where absolutely everybody who had a pair of eyes could see that Biden's health was degrading before us. And yet the entirety of the White House team seemed to go into the defensive mode of, oh, no, he's absolutely okay.
And the media as well.
And the media, everybody seemed to be kind of determined to push this one narrative. And then suddenly a book comes out which says, oh, actually, this was what was happening behind the scenes. And then it's like, oh, well, of course, we all knew this.
Yeah.
And it's like politics now seems to be in the game of kind of gaslighting the public. And I do think this is, like I say, in the grand scheme of everything that's going on now, it's not the most important thing. But I think it is storing up political problems down the line, because it just means you no longer trust a word that politicians, the media class, any of these people say anymore. And I think that really does sow up big problems for democracy.
So the trial of Makara from Kneecap has been suspended. People may know the Irish rap trio. One of them has been charged with essentially giving succor to terrorism. It's alleged that he flew a Hezbollah banner at one of his gigs. Tom, this is the best thing to happen to Kneecap, isn't it? The fact that, they've never get publicity like this otherwise.
I mean, it's very rare that you could say that being brought up on terror charges is the best thing that could ever happen to someone. But I think in this case, that's 100% true. Obviously, this is, it goes about saying outrageous where freedom of speech is concerned, being these outrageous, provocative, Israelophobic rappers, them doing these things to get a rise out of people. It is despicable when you're waving around the banner of an anti-Semitic terror army who have been, pummeling Israel for so many years. But at the same time, to suggest that this is some sort of involvement in terrorism or direct incitement to violence when the audience they're performing this to probably have never thrown a punch, let alone thrown any munitions, seems to me a bit ridiculous. And obviously, they should not have been hauled up on charges for this. They shouldn't have been investigated. State in which you've got the counter-terror police investigating rappers is clearly not in a very good state where freedom of speech is concerned. All that being said, it's been a perfect example, hasn't it, of the way in which censorship in certain circumstances can play so perfectly into the target's hands. If anyone saw the scenes outside of Westminster Magistrates Court this week, where you had hundreds of people gathering, waving placards or wearing their kind of trademark Kneecap balaclavas, which look a lot more like kind of tea cozies, really, but not as menacing as maybe they thought. It's allowed them to pose as they've wanted to pose throughout their short career as sort of radicals. They could originally burst onto the scene, titillating the English middle classes with IRA slogans, and now they've moved quite naturally into kind of anti-Israel bigotry. So it's one of those things where they wanted to pose as incredibly edgy, as a threat to the British establishment, and so on and so forth. And even though they're not, by any stretch of the imagination, it's a kind of character act cosplaying kind of exercise that they're involved in. It's fed into that narrative absolutely beautifully. So I wish that far fewer people took this ban seriously, much less the counter-terror police.
Joe, yeah.
Yeah, no, well, I agree with that. And I think it was interesting what you were saying in your Spike column today, Tom, about this being a very good example of the Streisand effect. I mean, I've got to confess, as a middle-aged woman who's not really up with the hip-hop scene.
You're not missing anything from these three, I should say that one.
Well,
bad.
I would not have heard of Kneecap if it hadn't been for all this publicity around them and the news, the way they kind of made headlines, first of all, predominantly for these anti-Israeli pathetic stunts that they pull, and this kind of pseudo Irish nationalist, anti-British kind of sentiment. I did try and listen to a few of their songs, and my ears started to bleed, and I gave up. I mean, it was more than I could stomach. And so then you look at the politics and you just think, actually, okay, as a middle-aged woman, I actually think my politics are more radical than theirs. What exactly are they saying that it is not said by every kind of, BBC journalist, Guardian columnist? It just seems that this is really, apart from that stupid stunt of the Hezbollah flag, their politics is absolutely the mainstream of political thought at the moment. The whole thing is just boring. The music is boring. The politics is boring. The only thing that's at all interesting about this group is the very fact that they've been put up on this trial. If we had more free speech, I could go to bed quite happily at night, never having heard of them.
And it's all too telling, isn't it, that there have been these sort of open letters from various lovies and, cultural figures in support of Kneecap. People saying absurdly that, you know, you're sensitive. You talk about Israel, Palestine, and you think this is the most talked about. But people would, you know, I'd quite like people to shut up about it sometimes. How could they? Whereas, you know, I don't know, someone like Lucy Connolly, I know she's not, you know, she's not an artistic figure, for instance, but there's no support in that world for someone like that for being able to speak their mind.
And I imagine that's part of the frustration why some people on the more kind of pro-free speech side of the argument maybe join the clamour for this particular set of charges maybe too readily, was because of the fact that they've seen people be put in prison for far less than, you know, than openly appearing to celebrate anti-Semitic terror army. I mean, there's people who were being certainly arrested for misgendering, and yet the very people who were writing these very noble open letters about freedom of expression were nowhere to be seen when that took place. So we found out where their line is, but this line is all over the place, seemingly. Yeah. So there's sort of double standards all the way down, but I think it's another good example, isn't it, of why the answer to two-tier speech restrictions or the answer to double standards is not to enforce the censorship more evenly. It's to argue against it from a point of principle. I suppose we've got a chance to here.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back at the same time next week. In the meantime, why not subscribe to Spike's YouTube channel and then click the bell so you're always alerted whenever there's some new content. Spiked is producing more videos than ever, from podcasts like this one to interviews to our series of polemics. You really, really don't want to miss out on it. Plus, to get your daily dose of Spiked, just go to spiked-online.com. That's our website at spiked-online.com.